Shall we move on to the main attraction?
Absolutely. So yeah, we've been going for quite some time, and of course, this is the part of it that I think we're most eager to see. So yeah, let's watch Christopher Hitchens, 1986, with the flock of seagulls haircut.
Thank you, Mr. Ridpath. Mr. Hitchens will be making the final 8-minute statement.
Thank you, Professor. I think that the organizers of this meeting are to be congratulated on their brio and also, I think, on their timing. We are met today as witnesses of the decomposition of a political regime in this capital city, which uses the language of capitalism and of free enterprise, employs the ideology of selfishness and self-interest, and stresses the rhetoric of laissez-faire, while bloating and expanding the role of the state, debauching the treasury and the currency, and relying upon a state within a state for the secret conduct of most policy. There may, and I think there will not be, any convergence of ideas between socialist and capitalist schools this evening, but this need not prevent us, I think, from seeing that a regime may combine the basest features of statism and collectivism with the basest elements of utilitarianism and libertarianism too. And I think if we recognize that, we may have ground for debate. What is it, I better get on with it, to be a socialist? Necessary conditions in my submission, rather than sufficient ones, must include the following. It is necessary to hold, firstly, that all divisions of class, nation, race, and sex are, in the last resort, man-made and can be man-unmade, are in no sense part of a divine or natural ordinance, and that we are members, like it or no, of one race, the human race. That civilization is, in fact, second, a cooperative enterprise, whether the cooperation is coerced, as it was in most of recorded history, or voluntary, as has been occasionally found and can still be found in our century. But that it is a cooperative enterprise cannot be denied. There is no other means, that's to say, of civilization. Third, that the limits of creative endeavor are set by the limits of nature, and that very few human actions can therefore be said in the last instance to be entirely private. The earth is, in point of fact, a common treasury, as the English levelers used to say in the Puritan Revolution, hoping that it was so. It is, in fact, the case, and again, whether we like it or not, whether we care to treat it as such or not. Fourth, that there is no God and no supernatural, that this recognition obliges us morally to maximize the felicity of the one life that we are permitted. And fifth, that the principle of from each according to his ability or her ability, and to each according to his or her need, is an easily realizable one, prefigured already in human society by the working principles of the bourgeois family. That unique engine of thrift, enterprise, the transmission of morality, operates precisely on the principle of from each according to his or her ability and to each according to his or her need. There is, in fact, no other way that a family could decently or possibly be run. I make no moral judgment as between the decency and the possibility. Such a distinction would be odious. Marxists describe freedom as the recognition of necessity, and only then proceed to say that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a stipulation that obviously implies its corollary, that the educator must be educated. That's why I stress the above as necessary conditions rather than sufficient ones. We do not ask for these things to be true. We might even prefer them not to be, but we must recognize them as given and as such. Sufficient conditions, I think, center on the question of class. Marxists recognize that history is indeed the contest of competing social forces, and that so is the present such a competition. All attempts to describe society as merely organic and harmonious, or as a free competition or race between individuals with differing attainments and endowments, fail, because they ignore this simple and obvious fact, which again we do not preach, we simply recognize, insist upon, and make as a point of departure. Let me, if I may, quote you from Marx and Engels' preface to the German ideology in 1845, where they say that they and their supporters, and I'm quoting now, "We do not preach morality at all. They do not put to people the moral demand, love one another, do not be egotists, etc. On the contrary, they are very well aware that egoism, just as much as selflessness, is in definite circumstances a necessary form of the self-assertion of individuals." I think this shows clearly enough that Marxists understand what Randians term, as if they discovered it, the virtue of selfishness. But as Marx and Engels also wrote in the same period in their Holy Family, they saw the need for selfishness to be transcended. I'm quoting again directly from the Holy Family, 1845 also. "If enlightened self-interest is the principle of all morality, man's private interest must be made to coincide with the interest of humanity. If man is shaped by environment, his environment must be made human. It is on this apparent paradox that we take our stand." And against the neo-Kantians, the early Marxists argued that morality could not be derived from abstract first principles of recht or right, but had to correspond to the real conditions of society. Nowadays, I think this argument seems quaint in its intensity and fervor, because evolution itself, and specifically the evolution of modern capitalism into a new symbiosis with the state, has borne in upon the dullest mind the recognition that if humanity does not yet think in terms of a common destiny, it has at least had to think in terms of a common fate. To put it at its most vulgar materialist level, we are all collectivized by the same ozone layer. The thermonuclear world is a great leveler, and just as there can be no purely moral, conscientious objection in a thermonuclear conflict, nor can there be any merely ethical or self-interested collaboration with it. Everybody, after all, in this auditorium is a uniformed conscript. You cannot conscientiously object to the nuclear conscription that has made of each of you soldiers and put you in the front line while the real soldiers are in the bunker. This recognition of reality enforces a sense of collective humanity upon us. Again, we do not preach this, we recognize it. Socialism, said Oscar Wilde, would free us from the distressing necessity of living for others. The feelings of compassion and solidarity and responsibility, after all, are no less instinct in our species than those of self-interest. It's precisely because these instincts of solidarity and compassion represent a human need, a need to be of help to others, a point very well made by Professor Richard Titmuss in his famous book, The Gift Relationship. Because they are a need, there is no need to make the sentimental presumption of altruism or to wrestle with the tautology that altruism represents. Marx and Engels, I'll close on this, in the preface to their 1848 manifesto, made capitalism a series of almost lyrical compliments. And in fact, few proponents of the capitalist system have ever summarized its virtues, those of creativity, innovation, the bursting of feudal and antique tribal fetters, as well as Marx did. But Marx and Engels also saw what's since become obvious, that capitalism is not the last word, and that in freeing mankind from ancient obligations, it made him a prisoner of market forces which also developed their own mythology and ideology, their own mystification, and their own bondage. Like Comrade Judas, I also believe that capitalism is the harbinger of socialism, that it's necessary not merely to contest or negate its ethical claims, but to transcend them, to build upon them. And from this, if I may coin a phrase, dialectic, I think we might get a truly human and unillusioned morality that was free from superstition or religion. On that realizable aspiration, I rest my case. Thank you.
Well, what's funny is that it was a lot more, it's different than I expected, in that it was a lot more materialist in many ways than Judas's explanation. It was probably more orthodoxly Marxist. If you probably take away his little aside about altruism, I think you could see a lot of logic in it. And obviously there's a love it or hate it kind of thing with some of his rhetorical tics and kind of Oxford education, like it or no. It's like certain things like that, which you could tell totally enraptured the American crowd. You know, you could say anything with a British accent and middle-brow Americans like us will eat it up, except for these particular people in this freeze frame. There's two guys in the audience who are definitely not pleased. But anyway, I'll let you dive into Hitch before I give more of my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I mean, for sure, the power of the British, the Oxford, accent over Americans, can't be understated, overstated. But and I do think that this is part of why, in the last 10 years, when I think that in a lot of ways, what he was saying was the least interesting, and even aside from the fact that I don't think it was right, like I think that it was just the sort of pushing some basic atheist stuff, often tied with with an overly simplistic view of the causal role of religion and various wars and stuff around the world, and then obviously the bad war on terror views, that's like the definitely the least interesting period of his life, but he said it so well and the accent helped so much that I think that was able to I think that masked some of the real problems with it. So I think that's
it gave the media a reason to have him on, as opposed to other proponents of barbarity, because he was able to express it better. And then occasionally he would surprise you, like he'd be on Morning Joe, presumably to provide cover for some sort of imperialist expedition, and then all of a sudden start going on a rant about how the CIA should be abolished and all its agents should be arrested. And then just completely surprise and shock and confuse those people, and or occasionally throw in a column talking about some great work of proletarian literature from the early 20th century, or review quite well, or debate Robert Servish on Trotsky, quite well. So it'd still like show these little bits and pieces, but overall, I think by the end, it was that the fact that what he was saying jived so well with conventional wisdom, with it that way, but he said it differently and with this other piece of knowledge that I think kind of got him more exposure. But if you look at the 80s and 90s, his best moments, his real TV moments, are mostly on C-SPAN, on book TV, which obviously was a bigger deal in the 80s than it is now, as opposed to later on when he got his NBC hits and whatever else.
Yeah, sure, and I think because he said the status quo things better than anybody else they could have had on, he was tolerated in his little eccentricities, like wanting to abolish the CIA, and the fact that he was actually, even in those last years, he was actually surprisingly decent on Palestine until the bitter end, and other things like this that came from his earlier his earlier worldview, which never entirely went away, and yeah.
So yeah, a couple things came to mind when the content of what he was saying. I think one is obviously his emphasis on nature and kind of common treasury sounds like a very like modern eco-socialist-y view, but in fact, it's really in Marx stew. If you read his critique of the Gotha program, he criticizes the Lassallean kind of view that labor is a source of all wealth, and I think somehow that view has been associated with orthodox Marxism, but Marx himself was critical of it. And just in general, it was good class analysis in the sense that it was like anti-utopian, like it situated like Marx and Engels as people who weren't aiming for this kind of crude egalitarianism that was rooted in like a voluntary abolition of egotism or selfishness. I think what their work got to is the fact that collective action against private property by workers was their route to express their individual interests. So in other words, if you're a worker in a factory, in order to be selfish and to fight for better wages and conditions, you had to figure out how to engage in collective action with other workers. And also at the same thing, at a social level, if you're a worker, you have to figure out how to aggregate your interests together politically with other workers in order to improve your lot in life as a class. And this is kind of what Marxists mean when we say that the working class is our agent of change and also is the universal class. It's a class whose particular interests jive with the generalized liberation of human beings. You know, we don't focus on workers because they're the most oppressed or the most worthy of pity. It's because of this power and because of this fact that it's, you know, in our view, the universal class.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I should say also in Critique of the Gotha program, not only does he say that that labor isn't the source of all wealth, you know, because nature also makes its contribution, but on the other end, he argues against like what I think a lot of people would assume would be the classical Marxist position that under socialism workers will get the full value of their labor. He actually argues against that, partially on the grounds that that you need to have, he wouldn't think of it as taxes exactly, but it says deductions to pay for things like schools and hospitals and other common needs. And also there's even a kind of half suggestion that it's unreasonable because different people have different capacities, and you don't want to have reward be based purely on that, even though he thinks it's kind of necessary for a certain stage that it's tied to that. All of which is just to say that, I think the picture a lot of people have of what the Marxist view is on labor and value and compensation is not is actually like a view that he argued against, which is just an interesting historical point. But yeah, I think that what Hitchens says about altruism is good. That I think he doesn't spell it out that much, but he seems to be striking a reasonable balance between saying that self-interest isn't illegitimate. In fact, as you point out, like the whole basis of the classical Marxist theory of change is that what's going to get people to enact socialism isn't mass altruism, but mass realization of collective interest. Although he's also not just doing like left objectivism. He says compassion and solidarity and all these things are as innate in us as selfishness. Which I think is just an important point to make, because the way that Rand herself, if you read, like she wrote something called The Virtue of Selfishness, argues, in the way that contemporary Randians will argue, is like they set it up as this false dichotomy between their position and being like a pure altruist who thinks that you can never do anything for yourself because you should just be constantly sacrificing your position to other people. Which is, of course, not only clearly not, Marx and Engels' position, but also, honestly, that pure altruist straw man, like that really maybe certain strands of certain religious views, but like overall that matches up almost nothing in the entire history of philosophy.
Peter Phrase, the Jacobin writer, calls it basically elevating the worldview of a 13-year-old boy to that of a ideology, political ideology, which I think captures it pretty well. I have to relatively soon log off to watch the Bills. My fiance is a Bills fan, but I do have. I mean, I'm guessing we won't have a chance to get into the Q&A and stuff, but I do have a few questions for you. One of which is, okay, so we saw this debate with, or at least the opening statements of the debate with objectivists. In your experience, what group of capitalist apologists do you find it easiest and hardest to debate? Like on the extreme on the left, I guess, like social democrats who don't really believe that there's a route out of social democracy, like a Sherry Berman type. Then on the right, these like hard objectivist, I guess, like what's the easiest to tackle and the hardest in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that certainly my own experience of this is very heavily tilted towards arguing with various kinds of libertarians. And hardest is a little hard to say because I think I mean, look, I'll say that the libertarianish person I've argued with, just to make this personal, who seemed to be most intense, was Yarnbrook from the Ayn Rand Institute.
Oh, I did. I remember I traveled around the country doing debates with him. Was it last year or something? Yeah, it was last year. It feels like forever ago. I spent a lot of time with that guy. You know, very annoying on the debate stage, but was nice enough when we got a bite to eat, before these events. But he was one of the libertarians who, like someone later in this debate, will just openly say, or objectivists, I should say, yeah, Jesus Christ was with the other guy. We don't like Jesus. He was mystifying. And in one particular debate with him, I kind of pandered to the crowd, which is had a lot of Christian conservatives in it, and basically just say this is a social belief and an egotism that would destroy the social fabric of community and civic life and whatever else. And I felt a little bit guilty, kind of quietly dog whistling, in a left communitarian way to the fact that these were crazy people. But anyway.
Yeah, no,
I think in my mind, the hardest people to debate are sometimes, if you find a good, in general, we're used to the social democratic argument of the post 59 European social democratic argument of we could wield capitalism to achieve these certain things. We've already achieved it. And our retort is often, well, look what happened after. Yes, there hasn't been complete retrenchment, but the welfare state has declined. You've left the levers of control in the hands of capitalists, so they were able to launch a counteroffensive against social democracy. So to be the real social democrat, to preserve social democracy, you have to go further into democratic socialism.
Right.
But I think those that come prepared with the empirical evidence of, okay, well, we still have these social rights and guarantees. We still have X amount of the GDP going to public spending, and we still have a presence for social democratic politics. Why gamble everything on a more radical break with capitalism? And I think of Sherry Berman and Ken Laneworthy and some other people as an argument that I think more radical socialists like us can win, but it does require a slightly different toolkit. And then also, obviously, there's a lot of defenders of capitalism who really do believe in a role for the state, who are willing to concede that there's different levels of state intervention. So they would defend both French capitalism, which is very statist in the 20th century, but also defend American style capitalism and talk about market failure. And obviously then it's a debate in which you don't really know what they're going to say. So you have to actually listen and respond versus these guys. It's it's the same script, which I guess is also true of very orthodox Marxists too.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although that does sound like the debate with Sherry Berman and those others, that does sound more interesting, I've got to say, than the one I watched with you. I think Yaron was a little bit more restrained with me. He was yelling about how we're going to expropriate his television set, because he grew up in a kibbutz and he knows how socialism works. But in any case, I think I would be interested in whether in those sorts of debate, any of those people who really defend that position, the extent to which they just stake their claim on, we don't need socialism because social democracy is more stable than we think it is, and the extent to which they would push back against the more principled ideological argument against stopping at social democracy.
I think a lot of it is political, in that they would say that socialists with, let's say, my mentality, who were trying to force the social democratic movement in the early 20th century and onward throughout the 20th century into a posture of opposition, ended up just ceding the state and government to the right with really disastrous compromises. But it was the socialists willing, in their account, like Sherry Berman's, to embrace politics and to embrace governing, who managed to with an uneven record and deal with the contradictions of managing the bourgeois state and deliver real gains for workers. So I think she would blame, let's say, even some of the failures of Weimar Germany, with socialists still half being in a posture of opposition and not really believing that they could do much for the bourgeois state, and also the UK Labour Party in the 30s that way, and socialists in Sweden later on, and in post-war social democracy being willing to manage the contradictions of the bourgeois state. And I think, again, that's an argument that has been dealt with in a few different places. I think there's a really good review by Dylan Riley in New Left Review, Bernstein's Hairs, that criticizes Berman's position from a slightly more orthodox, quasi-Trotskyist perspective, but it's really, well written. But I think that's like a nice, first of all, it's a nice, good faith debate to have from people who generally seem committed to improving the standing of workers. But that's something when our book comes out, I'm looking forward to figuring out the assortment of people to debate and have discussions with. Because obviously, the libertarians are easy because we're both fringe. Reason and Jacobin did that debate in 2019, and Vivek, I was just a sidekick. I was Puffy on the track, and Vivek Chipper was Biggie laying the good verses, and I was just his sidekick. But that debate was really good. But it's easy to be in dialogue with the Reason libertarian types. It's I think harder to frame the debate with people in the center. I think they're less apt to have those big ideological debates.
So they don't want to argue about whether exploitation is wrong in itself. Even if we can get some decent society while still keeping it. I mean, I guess I would say, I don't know if this is exactly the same question and as what's hardest, but I'll say that I definitely find myself getting the most frustrated in debates with other people who are basically radical leftists, but disagree with me about because they're tankies, or because they think that working within the Democratic Party is wrong, or whatever. And those are the ones where I find myself getting most frustrated. Although, and actually, I think credit where credit's due. When I was talking to him before he was on my show, I think Thaddeus Russell said something insightful about that. Since I sort of admitted to him, it's look, I don't really find myself getting very angry when I'm arguing with libertarians, but I totally get angry, when I'm arguing with other leftists. And he was like, yeah, of course you don't, because they're not in the family. You get, you get angry with other leftists because because you take it more personally, when you.
And also if we're coming to it from the same moral place, I think it can be frustrating to see people kind of get part of it, but not the rest. And also, I do think that within our tradition, there's a particular bit of a particularly annoying sectarian strain that can be almost Talmudic of let us dissect. People quote Marx at you to convince you that you're not a Marxist, which is is always a frustrating thing. And I always return to that Joan Robinson retort to one of her more orthodoxly Marxist friends, which is, the difference between me and you is that you have Marx in your mouth. I have Marx in my bones.
Which, shout out to our co-author, Mike Beggs, has his Zombie Marx article where he quotes that old Jacobin article, but worth looking up and reading for sure.
Speaking of, I think Mike's hard at work right now on the actual book. I got down 1,000 words today, a little bit more, about 1,250 words today. So I feel okay, but I did delete 400 words that I didn't like before. So there was a net gain of 100 words, which is, getting there slowly. So that's a future plug for people. I think we'll have something out maybe in fall 2022 for people to read.
Yeah, for sure. And I like the fact that you expressed it that way, since since I think you're writing about the history of whatever you want actually existing, whatever you want to call it, and you sort of talked about your work as if you were a low-level Soviet planner, talking about whether you're meeting your targets or not.
Yeah, because also it's all quantitative. It's not qualitative. I didn't say
Exactly.
1,300 words were any good. But I do think, like, especially going through this experience with both like this research and also for my last book or whatnot, I definitely have become more attuned to the fact that there were a lot of well-intentioned people trying to construct socialism at the level, like mid and low level bureaucrats and ordinary workers too, in countries like Hungary and Yugoslavia and Russia and the Soviet Union and so on. And there's a lot to learn from the experience, which I think should be complicated for socialists. And that if you just believe that this was all a totalitarian veneer from the very beginning, and socialism was just used as lip service to pursue a narrow class agenda of a group of new elites, then I think it's easy to just say, okay, we could figure out the technical aspects of socialism pretty easily if we have a more democratic system, if we have a more earnest and democratically responsive group of leaders, and so on. Whereas I do think that there were a lot of things that should worry us about why, let's say, the system of self-management in Yugoslavia failed, or why, for instance, there were so many coordination problems with Soviet planning. So obviously, I think there's some good answers to it. I think if anything, learning from these experiences makes us more credible as pushing for socialism of a very different type in the 21st century. But yeah, it's been interesting to kind of read all these accounts, and now it's time to stop reading and procrastinating and actually write the thing. But go Bills. I hope everyone in the chat is rooting for the Bills, unless you're from Kansas City, in which you have an excuse. But do you have any preferences? I forgot to ask.
Not really. No, I mean not in this. I think I'm not. Yeah, I mean I'll watch when we get done, but I don't have a strong rooting preference here.
Yeah. Well, we'll get together soon. I think the pandemic will be at least, hopefully, depending on how disastrous our vaccine rollout is, in a good enough place that we could watch the Super Bowl next year in a sports bar in New York or something. Like, so terrible. I can't wait to be able to like drink a Bud Light that's way overpriced at a midtown sports bar in New York City.
That sounds amazing right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't even imagine that after the last year.
But anyway, thanks a lot for doing it. I wanna do another, and maybe that. Have you already did the Hitch Iraq War one with George Galloway?
We did the Galloway one,
yeah.
Although I will say that there are a good number of Hitch Iraq War ones. So
we need to do one where he's cast as the villain now, because I feel like this is just like the prelude before he became Vader.
Yeah, fair enough. We could do. We could do one of the other ones for sure. I'm actually just trying to think off the top of my head what the other good like villainous Hitch debates were. Galloway is a classic, and the one he did with Peter is a classic. Although we watched that, but we'll think about that. We'll come up with something. Maybe have you back in a few weeks. I think I'll watch the 20 minutes until the Q&A with the chat just for the sake of completeness.
Wait, and also when you're in the Q&A though, skip ahead to I'll try to find you the timestamps. There's two awesome things in the Q&A that the audience should witness. So I'll try to find you the timestamps during like a commercial break or something, and maybe you could skip ahead and do like 30-second bite-sized bits, because one of them's like the audience just totally owns one of the Ayn Rand person. This like college student has a brief, funny retort, and then also in another one, one of the objectivists criticizes Jesus Christ as a socialist and Judeo-Christian values, which I think is funny. But.
Fair enough. So okay. So we'll watch I'll watch until the Q&A and then those 2 30-second bits. But go. But I know this is hurting you. So go watch.
Yeah. It's not a Knicks game because the Knicks are on the West Coast, and that's what I'll be doing at 10 p.m. But it's close. So I'll catch you guys later.
All right. See you later, Bhaskar.